Welcome to Sigest, your fortnightly science from the Bioeconomy Science Institute.
Kia ora koutou and welcome to Sigest, a very exciting Sigest today, as this is our very first one, no longer as just plant and food, but as our newly merged super institute, the Bioeconomy Science Institute. Today's Sigest, I think, is a really fitting one to celebrate our first podcast as a merged institute. We're going to be talking about soils in celebration of World Soils Day. And I think this is a particularly nice one, actually, because soils really are, in the most literal sense, the foundation on which a lot of BSI's science is built. So I'm really excited today to welcome Pierre Roudier, who is a soil scientist with the Manaaki Whenua group of the Bioeconomy Science Institute. Welcome, Pierre.
Kia ora, Rebecca. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I wonder if we could start perhaps today with a wee bit of an introduction just about you. Could you tell us a little about your role here and maybe some of your other roles as a soil scientist in New Zealand?
Yeah, so my name is Pierre. I've been in New Zealand for 15 years and previous to that I was working in Australia, and before that did all my studies in France. Does the accent, right? Yeah.
I'd have never guessed.
Yeah, I never managed to shake it off. But so I'm in a team called Land Use and Ecosystems within the Manaaki Whenua group of the BSI. And I've been working on soils for the last sort of 15 years within Manaaki Whenua, kind of at the intersection between statistics, quantitative approach to soils already, and the sort of mapping world, the sensing world as well, the sensors, so soil moisture sensing, spectroscopy, and all the cool satellite stuff, drone imaging, and all the sort of information you can bring in these days to try and inform your knowledge about soils throughout the landscape.
So on that, you're using all of these quite exciting tools for measuring things. What are some of the research questions you've been trying to address?
So there's a bunch of them ready. Some of the sensing work is trying to provide people with more, I guess, cost and time efficient ways to measure some of our key soil properties. Right? So I guess we'll get a chance to explore that, but there's many things you can look within soil. It could be chemical properties, it can be physical properties, it can even be biological properties, right? And I guess stark features of our soils in New Zealand in particular is they vary a lot. And, I often give the example that when you fly into Christchurch Airport and you go over the Waimakariri River, you see all these paddocks and they have all different shades of green that are matching different kinds of soil. So if you want to manage a landscape like this one, you need quite a lot of measurements, right? You need to cover that variability, which means taking a lot of measurements. And of course, there's only so much expensive reference lab measurements you can afford, generally speaking. So it's about giving, for example, our soil scientists doing mapping, the means to cover that variability throughout the landscapes and being able to have enough data to generate maps. It can also be related to counting stuff. So another thing we do within our team is storing carbon accounting. We're trying to make accounting exciting by doing it on stored carbon. And yes, it's basically trying to answer a simple question, but it's horribly complicated, which is how much carbon is in our soil, right? So again, this is where sort of statistics come to the rescue, and we're trying to find ways to basically give a more accurate number. Both it can be at the farm scale for people wanting to do, they may want to be carbon neutral. They may want to account for their carbon storage. It can even be a way to access markets, but it's also done at the national scale, right? So the Ministry for Environment, for example, has to report on that.
Sure. I feel like I've let us jump ahead a wee bit, and coming from a place of really total ignorance myself. I mean, to be fair, the main thing I know about soil is don't call it dirt in front of a soil scientist. For our listeners, and by our listeners, I really do just mean me, because I genuinely probably don't have a good understanding of this. World Soils Day, why should the rest of us care? What's so important about soils? I mean, I've blithely said it's the foundation on which all of our science is built, and literally, I guess that's true, but can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, of course. So World Soils Day is an initiative of the Food and Ag Organization, so from that United Nations organization, to celebrate soils. And it's just a good opportunity for us to stop and think, because you're right. Most of the time we don't really think about soils unless you're neck deep into it like we do. But most people won't take this opportunity. So it's a good opportunity to stop and think. And if you do that, it doesn't take long to relate, to build that connection to soil, right? If you think about what you had for breakfast, for example, most of the food that was on your table was likely derived from the soil itself, right? Whether that's milk, oats, bread, over 95% of our food that is grown on soil, right? So it certainly plays an absolute critical role in feeding us. So that would probably be the sort of first thing people think about when thinking about soil and celebrating them. But also there's a very wide range of other services that are provided by soil, right? So we hear more and more about sponge cities, for example, in the context of climate change with more extreme events. Compared to a big slab of concrete, soil will be able to store water. Yeah. So that's also has a role in agricultural production, of course, but in the context of sort of civil engineering, I suppose, it's a way to play its role of buffer when it starts to rain quite a bit.
That's something I think we've talked about quite a lot. Perhaps I should have said at the start, both Pierre and I are based in Canterbury, where we're recording at our Lincoln site. And Christchurch is probably a really nice example of kind of one of these emerging sponge city ideas, right?
Yeah. When you look at a lot of those sort of new greenfield developments, they are often paired with a functional wetland, with sort of a strategic use of low-lying wet soils. They're really good at capturing carbon as well, so that's good. But yeah, of course, they are engineered to capture that extra water. So that's just another example of all the services provided by soil. But I like to always keep in mind that it's also it gives some amazing service to humanity, of course, but it's an ecosystem in itself, right? And there's just so much life into it. That's how it functions. And that in itself is something I think worth celebrating.
Yeah, and something probably quite easy to overlook as well.
Yeah. It's I think it's easy to be drawn into the production of things, the agricultural production of things, which is fair enough. It's so critical to our survival, right? I like to also think of soils as a beautiful thing in itself. And sometimes you look at a road cutting and you see the soil profiles and you have that sort of that sharp succession of colors. And I think they're kind of beautiful in themselves.
Absolutely. Actually, you will probably laugh at this. I have a very vivid memory as a kid of a road trip through the Central Plateau and stopping somewhere in the car. In fact, I bet you if you go foraging through my childhood bedroom, this is still there. I have a fistful of some very red clay stuffed into a Ziploc bag. I bet you that's in a bedroom somewhere at my parents' house, thinking back on it. So, yeah, I absolutely agree. Beautiful in and of themselves.
A great way to stop for soil sampling. Great place to stop for soil sampling. Yeah, that would be those very spectacular volcanic soils on the Central Plateau. Yeah, I love to watch them.
So much diversity of colour as well.
Gorgeous.
Very, very cool stuff. So that's a little bit, I guess, about soils and why we should care. And we've touched very briefly on your science role at MWLR, but jumping back from that one, you have a wider role within the soil community in New Zealand as well, which is through the New Zealand Society of Soil Science. Do you want to talk about that a wee bit?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So I'm the current president of the New Zealand Soil Science Society, which is a society that I think bring together people that are practitioners of soil and land research really in New Zealand, both from the sort of, all the way from academia, ex-CRIs, so PROs these days, regional councils, policymakers, and also private practitioners. So we are an organization with about 300, just north of 300 members throughout the country. And yeah, the sort of society is going strong. We are having sort of regular conferences, regular newsletter, etc. It's our own little community. We're really proud of them.
Yeah, I think there's something really nice, and we get a bit of this in BSI already, but even more widely in societies like that, about having everything from the very academic kind of end of the community through to policy and folks that are perhaps literally in fields digging holes and providing advice to landowners and things. That diversity of perspectives and kind of each feeding off of each other, so your very academic folks can keep a long-term eye on what later impacts might be and things. That's a really nice position to be in. And I think between that and also perhaps it's a good time for our BSI listeners to acknowledge you've just come out of a pretty intense period of travelling around our different sites in our newly formed organisation as part of the Discovery Squad. You've probably got a particularly nice overview, I think, of the different kinds of research that's happening within the BSI. I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about, what are the diversity of topics that we are covering as an organisation?
Yeah, so I was very privileged to have this sort of chance to travel the country and see all the different sites, all the different research, as we come from sort of 4 independent entities all under the same umbrella. Super exciting. There's so much great research, and I could talk about it for hours. But specifically about soil, I guess the good aspects, and look, I'm hugely biased here. I acknowledge my bias, but I think it's a good thing about our little society, right? That we had already the mechanisms to keep people in touch, right? Mm-hmm. So we know each other fairly well. What you do see as you travel throughout the BSI groups is just the research in more depth, and in particular if I think of it from a society, social science society perspective, it's really encouraging to see 3 groups: Agri-Research, Scion, PFR, that are, I guess, aligned onto industries, and Manakfinua, which is more like a sort of landscape integrators. These are 4 groups that were all very active in soil science, and now they sort of come together. I've had a lot of informal chat with some colleagues about how we can bring our collections together, bring our data sets together, and really try and be a lot more ambitious about the products we can roll out, etc. So I ended up extremely energized after those meetings. The other thing you discover as well is just the sheer capability of the new organization. It's a much larger organization. It actually comes with perks, I think. And it means that we can also push soil science beyond its traditional limits, right? We can tap into, I'll give an example that's probably close to your heart, Rebecca, is genomics. One of the fantastic science we've seen with the Discovery Squad was, just the sheer capability, the incredible capabilities that you can find in New Zealand around genomics and even proteomics. Like, this begs to be applied to soil science. So yeah, I know I'll watch this space very carefully, because I think there are a lot of exciting things that will pop up the next few years.
I have to say I agree. I'm very excited. This is a podcast about soil, but in terms of the merger, just thinking about the sheer amount of capability that we're bringing together, but also the really potentially quite diverse perspectives on research topics. Things like land use. I think a lot of us think about those things a bit anyway, but the ability to approach some of those questions coming from slightly different mindsets or with slightly different priorities and then really bring those together to do some powerful stuff is super exciting. You mentioned a couple of sentences ago, collections. Tell me about soil collections within BSI. Whatever you mean by that. I understand there is literally...
Yeah, there is a physical archive called the National Soil Archive. It's in Palmas North, not far from the Plant and Food premises there, actually. So it's a collection of about 40,000 physical samples. So you basically think about jars full of sieved, dried soil. So quite a large collection of soils, really, and traces back to the late 30s or early 40s. So you get quite a cool history unfolding, in this shed. For example, some of the early samples, they're not in plastic; they're in jars that are glass, right?
In literal glass jars.
So they're literally samples that are pre-plastic era, right?
Yeah.
So we try to keep them in those glass jars and not get them to touch plastic, because I always, we always thought, it would be like an interesting study to do about microplastics there. Mm-hmm. There's also all sort of samples that went through, I guess, the Soil Bureau era, 1960s, 1970s, where some of these people would just measure a lot of properties, right? There's just a lot of properties were measured, stuff that we can't really not necessarily do these days, right? So we can bring those samples kind of back to life through sensors, for example, and say, well, maybe we can't do things like XRD, which is a way to characterize the type of clays, but maybe we can train a sensor using machine learning to sort of dig into those past results, pun not intended, and well leverage this sort of incredible legacy to produce new information.
By which you mean kind of finding proxy measurements you could take that give a good indication of things you might have measured in past.
Yeah, I mean, we're all getting excited about sensors, right? But often the way those sensing technologies work is they need some form of calibration. They need a calibration set. And that calibration set requires expensive reference lab measurements. Well, a lot of these measurements have been done in these like samples from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, etc.
I really love this because I feel like you might quite reasonably accuse scientists of being hoarders at times, but it's stuff like this that actually you realize later. You may not have realized what a treasure you had.
Exactly.
Maybe there were a few folks collecting that had foresight. We didn't. Sometimes we don't appreciate what we're doing in the moment, but it's so nice to have that resource to go back to. The
history of that collection speaks to that exact point, which is a key point. When DSIR was dismantled, and in 1993, I think they moved the old Soil Bureau facilities from the Hutt Valley to Palms North. They wanted to discard everything. And there's one man, and I think it's Craig Ross, who was my old boss, he's retired now, who basically took upon himself to hire a trailer and keep everything and managed to find some storage in Palmy, etc. Because back then it was considered, quote unquote, stamp collecting. Maybe it was back then. The reality is, 20 years later, we're surrounding in a world of sensor that really require that calibration set. And I talked briefly about my research about spectroscopy in the introduction. I would be nothing if it wasn't for that physical collection. That's what allowed us to really kickstart this work. We had that calibration set in our very hands when we started playing with this technology. We didn't have to build anything from scratch, right? So great example of how incredible work from the past allowed us to jump into the future.
Yeah, and I guess in your role, you're already kind of imagining what next with some of those new possibilities, right? So actually, before I move on, I guess it's geographically diverse. Do you have examples where it's collected from the same or really similar sites, but over time?
Yeah, so that's the question of monitoring, right? Which is probably even harder. A lot of these samples in the archive would have a timestamp, so you can sort of do that. But sadly, there hasn't been a lot of national scale data set that do so. We have to come to a lot more recent era with the National Soil Carbon Monitoring System. So that's a system that's been going on for a few years now that resamples every 4 years 500 sites that are scattered throughout New Zealand. And what this network tries to do is to detect any changes in carbon stock. So it's very carbon centric, but that's probably our best example today of a monitoring effort. Mm-hmm. What you do have, especially in agriculture, is kind of long-term trials. So it's kind of a variation on this. So it's probably more looking at the impacts of management, say, fertilizer application, that sort of stuff, through time. So the Winchmore trial, for example, which is probably the most famous one in New Zealand, has been going on for 60 years or something, like 70 years. It's going for a very long time. Again, data sets like that, everyone loves it. There's a tremendous amount of science that comes out of it, but it's really hard to fund.
To fund?
Yeah.
Yeah, arguing for that kind of work is not easy,
that long-term
right?
stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a literal collection of physical soils. We have soil maps as well, I guess. And one of the things that you and I have chatted a little bit about in thinking about this podcast is soil maps and soil classification. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the important fields of soil research is to map soil, right? So to properly manage your soil, you need to understand what they are as you go through the landscape. And the way to do that is to basically draw polygons throughout that landscape that say, well, this is soil A and this is soil B, and this is what, this is how different they are. So there's a New Zealand soil classification that's been established in the early 1990s by the late Alan Hewitt. He was one of our most brilliant soil scientists at Mauna Kea. And a bit like you have a taxonomy for life forms, like for trees or for any biology, really, you have a classification tree for soils as well. And similarly to the tree of life, knowing the family of a soil, for example, will tell you something about what they are, what they look like, what's their functional property like. Is it likely to be like a nice draining soil, or is it likely to be waterlogged? So you have this process of soil classification that's done basically by digging a hole and seeing what's there. And then you go through a classification process. Now, as I said, what people really want is maps, not a bunch of points throughout the landscape, right?
Yeah, sure.
So pedologists, who are the scientists doing this mapping effort, will basically build a mental model what they believe the soil distribution is throughout the landscape by digging those holes and sort of read the landscape to try to, little by little, assemble that jigsaw and then finally draw a set of polygons that sort of effectively maps those soils. That's been done since the early 40s. So you have had all these sort of different soil surveys, starting very humbly by, a very coarse scale kind of survey in the years where they were very, very much inventing everything, right? Like they had to
figuring out as they went.
Yeah, that was the pioneers already. Up to now with SMAP, which is the sort of national scale, 1 to 50,000 scale soil survey. Again, it's always interesting to turn back and look at our history. There's a rich history of soil maps that have been recently scanned and that which we use for new mapping as well. As it's always interesting to see the reports, see what people have been working on. And there's this effort towards a sort of unified, harmonized way to map those soils via something like SMAP.
So SMAP, tell me about that for folks who are not soil people.
Yeah, so SMAP, that's the national scale updated soil map for New Zealand. So that's kind of an ongoing effort, right? So it's not something that, it's not all the country is covered. It's little by little, people go throughout the country and do those sort of survey, mostly from scratch. So new efforts as opposed to just remapping something that's already been done. It's mapped at a scale of 1 to 50,000, which is kind of your catchment scale, I guess. It's not quite like farm scale, precision agriculture kind of scale. It's kind of the level up from that. So the critical bit to understand is that the map is only one element of a system like SMAP, despite the name. What's really powerful is all the database that's behind it. And all speaks to that soil classification. When you know that your soil has a certain name, right? When you can identify the name is in that tree classification of that tree of life for soils, you can tap into the database and try to infer some very specific properties of that soil. What's the pH? What's the clay content? Et cetera, et cetera. And this can be translated in information that can be used by policymakers, land managers, farmers, etc. So you can download what's called fact sheets, which are like 2 or 3 pages that tell you everything you need to know as a land manager about your soil.
Like a very practical, this is what you've got here, here are the considerations.
Yeah.
So the scale sounds actually impressively detailed to me, but in practical terms, how quickly does a soil type change? Is it, whoops, there's a riverbed and now it's something completely different, and does that kind of bisect my farm? It sounds very detailed. How quickly do soil types change? Like, is it a kind of a hard distinction, or do they grade into one another? What does that practically mean for people?
At a human scale, mostly they don't.
Right.
So what may happen is some form of, drastic human intervention. You think about, the way you can some practice around flipping topsoils, etc. can occur on the West Coast and things like that. But for
what do you mean by flipping topsoils?
also one of the management practices that's been implemented, I think mostly on the West Coast, is to take the soil and to flip
literally
it around.
invert it.
Yeah, it's a soil inversion. So there's a bunch of reasons why. One of the sort of reason why the sort of soil inversion is being studied, not only on the West Coast, but other places as well, is to promote carbon storage. So your topsoil being carbon rich, the idea is that you basically turn the topsoil into subsoil, so it's kind of quote unquote locked.
Right.
And then your subsoil, which is now exposed to the atmosphere, will slowly turn into topsoil again.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Would this work in my lousy Lincoln subdivision backyard with no topsoil?
Yeah, it's unlikely on a soil like that. That's
Possibly not on the timescales I'm hoping to get a garden started.
But to go back to your question, it's an interesting one because it also means that apart from this very drastic change in management, you're already altering the very nature of the soil. If you start moving stuff around, etc. Soil formation occurs over thousands and thousands of years. It's a very slow process. So it also means that if you invest in a good quality soil information, it's kind of forever, right? So the scale can change. So you may have had good soil information, but a pretty rough scale. So you may want for that scale to be a lot finer, to have more details about the exact contours of your polygons, of your soil units. But a good soil map is a long-term investment in that sense, right? Because some of the properties will change. Think about carbon, nitrogen, pH, water content. That's probably the stuff that varies the most quickly. But the classification will likely stay the same largely.
So the classifications that we've talked about so far, those literally relate to kind of physical and chemical properties of the soil, I guess. We've also talked a little bit before recording today about kind of their management classifications, the way that policymakers classify soils as suitable for particular uses. How do those two things relate to each other? Do they relate to each other?
Yeah, so the soil classification really is soil-centric. That's what it does. It tells you, the differences between soil types and gives it name, etc. Now, soils don't occur in a void, and they occur in a specific climate. They might occur in specific places or landscape positions. They may be on a very slopey ground. They may be on a flat surface. So the way to integrate that soil information into something useful in New Zealand is done through something called land use capability, LUC. And so the LUC is trying to give some context to the soil classification and looks at this land, I guess, from what can it do, what can it support. So we're looking at the limitation here, not only the soil, so you may have some limitation to cropping that are due to the soil, say fertility or physical properties, an impeding layer, something like that, or it's always wet. But you also have limitations that are due to the environment itself. Frost, it may be climatic limitation, it may also be due to topography. It may be a very steep slope, for example, which brings erosion risk. All right, so the LUC is sort of embedding all that into 8 classes, 1 to 8. LUC 1 being basically the best land we have in New Zealand, and 8 being the most limited land. So it's not the worst land, it's the most limited land from a lens of production. So,
right. So it is really a primary production classification.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
And LUC 8, 7 and 8 will mostly be conservation land, right?
Right. So they might be beautiful soils, but you can't touch them. Or they're on steep mountainsides and there's just no way you're going to anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can't really crop them or farm them. Yeah, and you shouldn't.
We talk a little bit about the way that urbanisation starts to encroach on some of those good quality soils as well. I don't really know what my question here is, other than to kind of note that that's an issue, and it seems like a little bit of a clunky way of having the conversation, maybe.
Yeah, so LUC, so that land use classification is sort of being in the policy discourse this last few months for that reason. And so you have to really take a step back and look at how land and soils are important resource for humanity. And you have this problem everywhere. Successful cities, are not successful at random. They're successful for a reason. They're successful because they have plenty of nice natural resources.
Yeah.
And first of which is soil. But as the city gets more powerful, they will encroach onto the very resource, or one of the very resources that made them successful in the first place, right? So we see this in New Zealand. We can see the urban encroachment affecting some of our best soils. We see it in Europe. We also see it in the South Pacific, in the Pacific Islands as well. It's a sort of global trend. So soils need protection. They need some level of protection, because if you let things go, they will be encroached on, and you essentially lose your best soils to urbanization. I think there is also a belief amongst New Zealanders that are feeling through the general population that, we're this sort of green, lush country blessed with plenty of really good soils. And actually, we kind of don't.
Yeah.
Right? We have a lot of very cool soils and very diverse soils, but if you take that production lens, if you take that land use classification, level 1, so the best soils in our country, is less than 1%. I think it's 0.7% of New Zealand. It's super limited and it's super patchy, right? We got some little patches of LUC1 here and there that have been sort of protected, but it's super spotty, and you don't build food resilience or food security resilience just on LHC1. So you also need the other classes to come and agglomerate them. So what I talked about just now, it's really affecting LUC1 and 2. So those two are really less than 5% of our country. They're the top soils, but sadly, a large part of them have already been lost. What we see is that sort of higher classes, LUC3 in particular, which is a little bit more limited, but still a very good land. That's the core of the dairy farming in New Zealand are on LUC3. It's kind of it's sort of like a glue for that good land, if you want, right? So you have spots and spots of LUC1 and 2 that are really sort of just held together by LUC3. That's critical, because if you're a farmer, you can't really farm just on little spatial clumps, right?
Sure.
You need a consistent, coherent piece of land that can support your production.
Yeah, and that's not even at the single farm scale, right? Because there's all of the kind of infrastructure that goes around primary production. I guess I'm probably thinking a little bit about stuff like pack houses, I guess.
Yeah,
you don't get one kiwi fruit orchard. You need a bunch of them, because that supports all of the other stuff that goes along with it.
Yeah.
It's something that I'm very excited about the BSI merger, I guess, is all of these brains bringing all of these pieces to those kinds of conversations where you can kind of go, I mean, I hope we already did this to some extent, but perhaps we are better enabled to take that really holistic view of how we are using our land resources, all of our resources, and how we optimize is a little bit of a funny word, but how do you do that in the best possible way with the most kind of long-term good outcomes in mind? Something I'm sort of curious about is what new directions do you see us being able to explore as this merged beast of an institute in the soil science area in particular? Are there things you think we can do now that perhaps we couldn't as individual groups, or couldn't quite as easily as individual groups?
Yeah, I mean, there's like the fundamental mechanism of the merger, I think, are exciting, because despite the accent, I've been here 15 years, and I think what I'm hoping is that collaboration becomes a second nature for some of it. Like, we're all under the same internal structure, all the same funnel, and I'm hoping we develop that second nature of I'm going to reach out to people in that group, because I think this is relevant. While I guess kind of the reflex over this last decades would be like, oh, this sounds like something I need to bring someone from there, but am I allowed to? And I always sort of wonder how much of a project didn't happen, not because anyone said anything, but just because of that almost unconscious censorship of collaboration. So that I'm excited about that. But for a less boring answer, but something more specific maybe, I would love to see things around soil biology and build some explicit links between soil biology, soil chemistry and soil physics. And sort of bring all these different kinds of soil science together. There's really, I guess, a legacy of these things being sort of separated. You can also think almost about, agronomy. We're in an era of multidisciplinary research, and in that sense, I can't think of a better time as we merge of there's all these cool genomics tools that are being developed all across the BSI, sometimes for very different reasons, right? For breeding, etc. Soil science will benefit hugely from the development of these technologies, I hope.
It's definitely a very exciting time for us, I think. And not only in bringing together the distinct capabilities or different ways of approaching some of these problems from our legacy organisations, but also we are kind of in general in a time where suddenly we've got all of these new tools and ways of exploring our data and potentially so much more power to start digging into. Maybe it's the historic collections that we've got, or these kind of data sets that are parked over here from 10 years ago that someone did their bit with it, but actually that data is still important and useful, and maybe we can start to dig into it in different ways and bring different brains to it. And I think we're a bit of a behemoth of an organisation now, 2,500 people or something, but also more infrastructure and more resources, potentially more computing power, which I think will be really important for exploring some of these kinds of things. Are there any bits of that, kind of the infrastructure side of it, that you see being different?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. We're bigger, but it also means we can be ambitious now. We can do stuff that are hard, right?
Yeah.
So, and if you take as an example the legacy stuff, we talked about the physical collection earlier on. There's a lot of physical data sets. By physical data sets, sorry, it's a bit confusing wording maybe, but it's like legacy data sets that haven't been digitized, that are on cards, right? Thousands of them. I mean, now we can tap into this, right? I think for years we've always known about their existence, but didn't really get the bandwidth, I guess, to try and capture these. Now, I think as a consequence of that scaling up of our institute, but also the development of things like AI, machine learning, automated character identification, OCR, and all that stuff. We can think about reviving that data, reviving all these thousands of observation that's been done throughout the landscape, and they can guide us towards better soil information products.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's the same in soil science. I know certainly within genomics and molecular biology we have some pretty amazing data sets, but it's also, I don't want to trivialize the amount of work that would go into these digitizing efforts and the kind of, do we even have the metadata that we need to do a good job of this? So super exciting, but someone gets the job of doing the grunt thing on some level. Even with all of our ability to automate things, it's still, I guess something I think about a lot is the role of kind of curating this information too. That still seems like a very human task.
Yeah,
Finding it and making sure the information that is with it is correct before you let whatever cool new AI tool loose on it, so that we can make best use of it. But it is super exciting, and I'm sure that soil science certainly is probably an example of this. Genomics certainly is an example of this. And I bet it's true for a lot of the other flavours of science that we do within BSI too, where you've got these cool legacy collections, but you still need people to really take the time to get them into places where we can make the best use of them, and digitising them will be a huge part of that. I'm conscious that we've been talking quite a long time. Are there other things that you'd like to kind of cover while we're here? What's exciting for you looking forward?
So I've just looked at sort of the emerging trends internationally in soil science, and I think some of them are really relevant to New Zealand. And I sort of think that now we are getting into the BSI, we can be ambitious and tackle these. One example that just springs to my mind is soil moisture. How much water is in your soil at any point in time? It's such a critical amount of information. Like, the amount of water in soils drives so much stuff. Of course, if you want to produce any sort of crop, you need to water it, but not too much. So you need to have this information, right? And years ago we worked in irrigation, precision irrigation, and tried to use soil moisture information to automate how much water was applied on a crop. And basically we found that compared to a normal way to do things, quote unquote, you'd save up to 30% of water without any yield loss. So that's information that's very important, but that goes well beyond agricultural production when you start looking at things like flood modeling and etc. It's something that was very much a precision agricultural product back in the days, because you'd have to, put probes in the ground. You could see a farmer do that. We had to solve all these issues of transmitting the data and bring the intelligence back to the pivot irrigator so it would modulate the water. But on a farm, I could see it work. Again, we're in water sensors now, so I think it goes well beyond the farm gates these days. For once, you could very well look at things at the catchment scale and say, I'm going to try and federate all the different sensors that occur in that catchment. But you can be, I think, a lot more ambitious now and say, well, how can I leverage the massive quantities of remote sensing data that are collected day after day? The satellites are up there. They are recording data whether we
whether
use
you
it
like
or not.
it or not.
Yeah, and whether you like it or not, yeah. So you're starting to see those products at different scales and for different countries, but that would very well be relevant for New Zealand to say, well, this is our best estimation of how much water is in your soil at this specific day for this specific pixel. That sort of products, I think, are interesting because they're bringing what I really enjoy actually in soil science, which is that multidisciplinarity. People doing remote sensing, people doing math, statistics modeling, understanding the impact of the type of soils in the way your soil moisture will change in time, bringing weather, bringing climate. What could we do in terms of modeling forward, forecasting? We know
and you
that
can imagine very immediate practical kind of things like flood risk modeling from a given rainfall event that's next week. That sort of thing could be really informed by that, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's cool. It's exciting stuff. I feel like I'm trying to wrap up, but we touched really briefly on soil carbon, and I'm kind of curious about that as well as something that you're monitoring actively. Do you see potential in that space as well? What's exciting there?
Yeah, so I guess the exciting developments more recently was about opening that black box. Because for years we were always interested in soil carbon because it's the largest reservoir of carbon past the oceans. So so in terms of terrestrial reservoir of carbon, soil is the biggest one by a long shot.
And you want more carbon in your soil, right? Whereas you potentially don't in your ocean. Yeah,
that's right. So increasing carbon in soils, generally speaking, it always comes with good stuff, right? You get better moisture retention, better soil fertility, etc. It's generally a good thing. Right, so so that's why you sort of want to bring the carbon from the atmosphere, the CO2, and pump it into your soil using our natural pumps, which is crops, and through photosynthesis. That's essentially what's happening, right? So plants would take up CO2 from the air, and through their roots they would get soil carbon. So we've had this idea around carbon sequestration, the fancy word is, for years. What's I think exciting recently is to say, well, there's more to it than just carbon, just total carbon. And it's about trying to characterize that carbon, realizing that once those plants are putting carbon in the soil, that carbon can have different pathways. They can, the carbon can occur in different forms. Some of these forms would be pretty labile. In other words, if you think about carbon cycling in that soil, because it's full of bugs, because it's an ecosystem again, so it brings us back to soil being a living mantle, right?
Yeah.
That soil will be respired, will be consumed by these little bugs, meaning that carbon will go back to the atmosphere.
Right, and so it's not all equally well sequestered.
Yeah, and some other forms of carbon are called mineral-associated carbon, and they will be effectively protected physically by things like clays.
Right,
and
so that's an interaction with soil type.
Yeah,
more.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's kind of physically protected from the bugs. All right. So, and both are important because soil is an ecosystem. It's not a bank for humanity to put the extra carbon, right?
Yeah.
So you need to find that balance, right? But if you want to sequester carbon, of course you want it to be protected by those minerals, which bring the question, but what mineral, what type of clay, etc. So we're sort of exploring, if you want, the impact and the correlations between the different types of soil, the different types of clay that may occur in these soils, the impact of climate, and the impact of also land use and land use changes that may occur.
Pierre, this has been such a fascinating introduction, for me at least, to soils and soils at BSI, and I think a really excellent celebration of World Soils Day in our newly merged institute. I know you've got a seminar coming up around about the same time and for the same kinds of purposes. Where could we find that for listeners who are interested perhaps to hear a bit more?
Yeah, so for World Soils Day on the 5th of December, we, amongst other things, are doing a seminar called a Link Seminar, and that's led by my colleague Paul Madge. I'll play host for that one and do a short introduction. But yeah, we've got this Link Seminar, about soil, the future of soil in New Zealand, kind of a strategic view of what's next for soil science in New Zealand and for fostering that link to policy in particular. So I encourage everyone to sort of register and tune in on World Soils Day. But mostly, I think, again, it's a good opportunity to think about, pause and think about the soil and about what it's doing for us. And maybe it can be as simple as what you did as a child, Rebecca, and stop and have a quick look by the road and at a nice road cutting.
I'm so curious to find out whether that bag of soil is still at home. I might actually go when I leave here and text the old family group chat, see whether it still exists. Thank you so much for this chat. It's been so interesting, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about kind of how things go from here for soil science, but for all of us in the BSI as we move forward. I think it's a really exciting time. Thank you as well to our listeners for joining us today. As ever, we really do appreciate if you can like and review our podcasts. It helps us get our visibility up. You'll be able to find this, as ever, on all of your typical podcast channels. Thank you so much, Pierre. Thank you to our listeners. Mā te wā.